A possible defeat for the PM in the Lords, a soft coup within the Labour Party, and fresh elections coming up in Northern Ireland. Welcome to TIP TV Politics. On the show this week, independent peer Lord Hannay gives us the latest on the Brexit amendment in the Lords. We talk Northern Ireland elections with Akash Paun from the Institute for Government and Mick Fealty, editor of Slugger O'Toole. On Scotland, journalist and commentator Robert Somynne, and talking through the week's news, Jonn Elledge of the New Statesman and Labour Councillor Sam Stopp, editor of Labour Vision and chair of the Labour campaign to end homelessness. Hello and welcome to the show. So, just what was to blame for Labour's defeat in Copeland? The constituency, which has been Labour since 1935, that's more than 80 years, saw a swing of more than 6% to blue. It's the first by-election game by a governing party since 1982, with the Tories, of course, calling it a truly historic event. But it's not all bad news for Corbyn, though. In Stoke, a Leave-voting Labour heartland constituency in the north, UKIP's Paul Nuttall barely scraped second place. And it seems like pancakes aren't the only things up in the air for UKIPers today. Major donor Aaron Banks has demanded to be installed as the party chairman, or he'll take his money elsewhere. And currently a very public spat is taking place between Douglas Carswell, UKIP's only MP, and Nigel Farage, who apparently now spends his weekends dining with President Donald Trump. Aaron Banks has waded into this bust-up for good measure now, saying he will also be challenging Carswell to his constituency in Clacton. If he succeeds, the number of UKIP MPs will go up from 1 to, well, you guessed it, 1. So it's all progress. But for Labour, it's not just the result in Copeland which is now causing headlines. On Sunday, while some took aim at the media for Labour's electoral woes, it's an article by Shadow Chancellor and staunch Corbyn supporter John McDonnell saying that there is a soft coup underway in the party, which is continuing to rumble on. Sam Stopp, is the soft coup going on? And what the heck is a soft coup in the first place?
Well, it's not the first time that John McDonnell's dusted off his tinfoil hat. It was a very strange article that he wrote, and I think it was one that he wrote in anticipation of more than one by-election defeat last Thursday. There isn't a soft coup going on. What he means by that is the idea that there is some kind of Illuminati in the Labour Party subtly undermining Jeremy Corbyn and his acolytes. I think they're doing that for themselves, to be honest. What he may have been right about, however, was that the Parliamentary Labour Party has adjusted its tactics correctly by allowing Jeremy Corbyn to basically bring about his own downfall. The Owen Smith challenge to Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was obviously a disaster, and frankly the party centrists, the moderates, don't have the numbers to beat the Corbynites in open battle, basically. So what they're doing is attempting guerrilla tactics.
I mean, John, is Sam right here? I mean, regardless of this soft coup attempt, whether it exists or not, Corbyn's not going to be going anywhere anytime soon.
It's incredibly difficult to see what could possibly shift him short of an act of God, to be honest. I mean, he has to go of his own accord, which he's shown no desire to do. So, and I think Sam is right that there is very little appetite in the parliamentary party to launch another coup, because the last one was so draining for everyone concerned, and Corbyn looked strengthened rather than weakened at the end of it. I find the rhetoric around the soft coup quite interesting, though, because it does just feel to me like quite a insular way of delegitimizing criticism. It's a way of kind of sort of saying that anyone who criticises the leadership is somehow part of this shadowy cabal of Blairites, backed by Peter Manders and whoever it may be, and therefore nothing negative that anyone ever says about Jeremy Corbyn can possibly be considered a legitimate critique. Now, that's not going to do much to win support in the country, but it will probably sort of shore up the true believers as the news gets worse and worse.
I mean, Sam, is this just going to be the thing now that active leadership members of the Labour Party, such as Tom Watson, are just going to be openly critical of Corbyn, particularly his performance in the polls from now on?
Well, Tom Watson, in fairness, has actually been very subtle in his criticisms of Corbyn, and I think the Parliamentary Labour Party could do with a few more like Tom Watson, who are very adept at transferring people's attention onto Corbyn's failures rather than allowing themselves to look as though they are the problem. And part of the problem with
he did say, I mean, everyone with leadership roles in the party must take a long, hard look at ourselves and what's not working.
Well, he has a leadership role.
Of course, but I mean, there is one leader, and
Yeah.
that would be Jeremy Corbyn.
But that's an example of his cleverness, and he knows that he needs to, as I say, divert people's attention towards the elephant in the room, but to, you know, he never called on him to resign. He's never been openly, explicitly critical of Corbyn, and that's because he knows that people need to come to their own conclusions about Corbyn.
Okay, well, let's leave that story there, and on to our second, which is, of course, the Scottish referendum. Now, a second referendum is on the cards. That's according to a report this week that Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister and SNP leader, will ask Downing Street for another national plebiscite in March, coincidentally at the same time as Article 50 is triggered. And while the Prime Minister Theresa May won't want to call another referendum, she might be forced to give one if Miss Sturgeon does ask. To stop this problem going any further, Theresa May will reportedly use a speech to the Scottish Conservative Conference on Friday to try and stop the growing demands from nationalist politicians. Joining us now from Scotland is journalist and commentator Robert Somynne.
Thank you for having me.
Just give us an idea of what you see as the public opinion for independence in Scotland now.
Well, we're at a rather tense situation because really the polls have been showing an average of scores that have shown both positions haven't really moved. Yes, there's been creeping up of the position of yes, the pro-independent side, but really we're back where we were in 2014. And it's going to be really difficult. It was always going to be really difficult for the pro-independent side because they are fighting against the status quo. And there's a real risk that the Brexit vote or the vote in Scotland to remain is being interpreted as a desire to want to shape things up in Scotland, whereas actually most people voted remain in Scotland because they really wanted to be left alone and they wanted things to more or less stay the same and be stable. So as far as the polls go and as far as public opinion goes in Scotland, independence has become slightly more attractive, but it's hard to say that it's at any point been a majority opinion.
I mean, before we came on air, I looked at the latest opinion polls from What Scotland Thinks, and according to it, in February, a yes vote for independence gets 44%, a no vote gets 51%, with don't know at 6%. So that would imply, am I right, that independence is still, despite Brexit, not the majority opinion of the Scottish people?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think actually the First Minister, the SNP, the Scottish Government would all concede that. I suppose that the counter-argument to that would be, well, you consider where the Scottish independence vote was last time. It was frankly puny, but it rose to 45%. The argument coming from people in the Scottish Government is that if you start from a level of 44-45% now, you have a campaign going on for several months, especially with Brexit around the corner and the type of Brexit that may encourage people to vote for yes. A vote for independence is more than achievable.
Okay, Robert Somynne, journalist and commentator based in Scotland. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Sam, is this story about Nicola Sturgeon calling for a second referendum in March just sort of scaremongering? It's a good political headline, but it's not really necessarily accurate.
She's testing the water. I think she may do it. I'd be very surprised if she did. I think she'd be foolish to, because she knows that were she to call another referendum and were she to lose it, then that would take the issue off the agenda for the next 30 years, perhaps. So I think at this point the stakes are far too high for her to take that risk.
And John, in terms of support or at least sympathy for the independence of Scotland, or people who want to be independent from the UK, after Brexit, when the majority of the Scottish people voted to remain, but we are leaving, do you think there's more sympathy in the UK for an independence call?
I think there are certainly those who were on the unionist side in 2014 who are now thinking, oh, I don't want to be trapped with Tory England, maybe I should have voted for an independent Scotland. So I think there probably will be those who are reconsidering their position, but the difficulty they've got is it's kind of the actual practical arguments for an independent Scotland are, if anything, even weaker than they were before, because most of Scotland's trade is with England and the other UK countries rather than with Europe. If if the UK leaves the European Union, it's incredibly likely Scotland's going to effectively have to apply to be a new member. You'd be looking at a hard border between Scotland and England, which is nonsensical, really. It's just incredibly difficult to see how that's going to work.
And you've also got questions of sort of EU budget rules, the euro, exports to the rest of the UK.
Scotland might need to be in Schengen, and you might have to have passport checks at Berwick upon Tweed. It's nonsensical. So I think it's incredibly difficult to see how an independent Scotland would actually work with the rest of the UK outside the European Union. So whatever sympathy there may be for the idea, I don't really see it happening. My suspicion is that Nicola Sturgeon is basically just trying to push Theresa May into denying her the referendum, because that will play quite well in domestic Scottish politics.
We just mentioned sort of Theresa May going to give this speech at the Scottish Conservative Conference on Friday, hoping to push off this demand early. What would Theresa May, do you think, what should she be saying which would give that kind of corrective?
I think the difficulty from Theresa May's point of view is, or rather from the point of view of someone observing Theresa May, is she's very good at representing a particular type of English opinion, typified by her own home county's constituency in Maidenhead. But all the way through her premiership so far, she's been closing off options where she could have been giving things to Scotland to kind of encourage them, to show that she wanted them to stay in the Union. She could have been talking about making Brexit easier in Northern Ireland. She's not done any of those things. She's just pushed the Brexit means Brexit line. We're going to get her vision of Brexit as negotiated with the European Union. And there's no sign that she wants the other UK countries at the table at all. So it's not, to my mind, a question of what she could offer them. It's whether she's minded to offer them anything. And I suspect the answer is no.
I mean, Sam, the Kezia Dugdale and Ruth Davidson and prominent unionist politicians sort of make the case that the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon are using the independence call as a way of hiding Nicola Sturgeon's declining popularity and the SNP's poor performance or perceived poor performance in Scotland. Do you think that that is a good argument to be making against Nicola Sturgeon? Do you think it will be effective in terms of gaining support from the Scottish electorate?
I don't think it's a good argument to be making. I think there's some truth in it. I think that the SNP have had their high water mark now. They will remain the dominant force in Scottish politics for some time to come. But to simply throw an argument at her like that is clutching at straws, really. The problem, particularly for my party, the Labour Party, is that it has such a bad rep with Scottish voters that was built up over so many decades that it's going to take a massive amount of time to turn around that perception and to rebuild links with working class communities in Scotland. And this kind of argument is going to make very little impact.
Okay, we'll leave that there. Jonn Elledge and Sam Stopp, thank you very much. Now, Friday sees citizens of Northern Ireland take to the ballot box to elect a new government after the executive collapsed between the Republican Party Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. Sinn Féin withdrew from the power-sharing Stormont administration in early January, saying they could no longer work with the DUP. But there are now fears about whether the two parties can reach a new power-sharing arrangement. But what could this all really mean? We looked in focus with Akash Paun from the Institute for Government and Mick Fealty, editor of the blogging website Slugger O'Toole. Akash, just tell us what you see are the implications of this election for the power-sharing arrangement in Northern Ireland.
Well, so the basic structure, the constitutional settlement for Northern Ireland, as established in the 1998 peace deal, requires that the largest party from the unionist and the nationalist communities come together to form a power-sharing government. It's a mandatory coalition, if you like. And obviously the breakdown of the coalition between the DUP and Sinn Féin a couple of months ago is what has led to this early election. So the big question after this Thursday is, assuming those parties remain the largest parties, which is another question, can they somehow come back together to form a functioning government? Because if they can't, then under the terms of the current constitutional arrangements, there will be no devolved government in Northern Ireland, and then presumably, we revert to direct rule from Westminster.
I mean, Mick, how divided do you see the parties at the moment?
I think they're very divided, and the fact of the election itself has deepened that division. I mean, it's strange to say that it didn't happen over Brexit. They agreed to differ over Brexit, which is a pretty major thing for these two parties to have done. DUP campaigned very heavily for a Brexit. Sinn Féin less so energetically, but nevertheless was anti-Brexit and will certainly run its politics as that. None of that came into play. There was no arguments about the Constitution, whether Northern Ireland should stay in the United Kingdom or go out, all the traditional stuff. It happened over a scheme for burning wood pellets, which had been overpriced in the First Minister's former department several years before. And it wasn't an issue until the BBC got a hold of it in Northern Ireland and ran a documentary that explained to the voters what had happened. And at that point, the government didn't fall apart immediately. Took several weeks, and Martin McGuinness's illness, very serious illness, before the whole thing just seemed to fall apart. And now they've headed for the exit. The rhetoric is markedly different from this time last year when we had an election, an assembly election in May. This time it's aggressive. This time Sinn Féin are accusing the DUP of being bigots and impossible to work with and thwarting all their agenda. So on the excuse of it falling apart before Christmas, as Jerry Adams says, it never wastes a good crisis, and it does seem to me that they've scaled this one up massively from before, without, interestingly, ever introducing a red line about how they might get back into power again. I mean, so I think we're looking at a hiatus here of some period of time. I
mean, in terms of what happens after this election, do you see there as any real alternative as to the kind of power sharing arrangement that there was that has existed up until now?
Well, there can't be any change unless both the DUP and Sinn Féin agree to it. I think the DUP has always said that they would quite like to get away from the mandatory coalition. That is, when you come in, you have to work with whichever party the other community chooses as their, if you like, tribal champions. DUP would quite like to get away from that. They'd like some kind of qualified majority voting where there has to be a certain number of people from the minority in government before it can actually work. But as it stands at the moment, they can't get anything past Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin can't get anything past them. My suspicion is we will come back to this model sooner or later in a modified or a very similar situation, but with the possibility that the British government might expedite some of the policy issues that Sinn Féin have been unable to get past the DUP for the last 10 years.
I mean, Akash, is that something you agree with? Do you agree that there isn't really any alternative that could be had here between Sinn Féin and the DUP?
Well, I think, as Mick said, I mean, changing that rule, the legal requirement for the two sides to work together, I don't think that's on the cards. I mean, that's embedded in the Treaty of 1998. It was agreed between the UK and Irish government, as well as all the parties in Northern Ireland. So, yeah, that's the system that one way or another the parties in Northern Ireland in the end have to make work, because direct rule is the alternative. I mean, back in 2002 power sharing broke down in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and then it took 4.5, nearly 5 years to get the parties back together in government, during which period, it was the Labour government in London that ruled Northern Ireland. But if you look at the public opinion surveys in Northern Ireland going back through this whole period, that's never been a very popular option. It's certainly not the preference of any of the major parties either. But it sort of hangs there as a backstop if political dysfunction means you can't form a functioning coalition. Then that becomes the only solution.
I mean, what Mick mentioned it earlier on, Brexit. I mean, what has been the impact on Brexit with regards to the politics and the political tensions in Northern Ireland?
Well, yeah, I mean, Mick described the immediate catalyst for the collapse of the coalition as being that specific issue about the poorly managed scheme for supporting green energy. But the divides on Brexit are now very apparent, and we're about to trigger Article 50. The negotiation process is about to get underway.
What about the hard border, hard soft border? How's that playing out in Northern Ireland at the moment?
Well, I do think, that is at the heart of it. If you look at what the Republican and the Nationalist parties are saying, so Sinn Féin, the SDLP, also interestingly the Non-Aligned Alliance Party, they're calling for Northern Ireland to be given some kind of special status, the other side of Brexit, by which they mean Northern Ireland somehow remaining within the single market, the customs union, so that there is no hardening of the border between the north and south parts of Ireland, but instead potentially a hardening of the sea border between the islands of Ireland and Britain. And that's something that on the unionist side they surely wouldn't be happy to accept.
Mick, do you agree with that? How important is this dilemma over the border, whether it's a hard border or a soft border going into Brexit, to the politics of Northern Ireland?
Well, I think at the moment the politicians are playing it up for all it's worth. I saw this reenactment of an old border post. Looked exactly like it did back in the 1960s before the conflict. So there were no soldiers, but armed police. And that was something that Sinn Féin will want to play on over and over and over again, because there are a lot of legitimate economic anxieties about farmers, large farmers, often Protestant farmers, who sell their milk yield now south of the border to creameries in the south and co-ops in the south. There are some serious economic anxieties about that. Whether it's as big an issue as people think it's going to be in the longer run, I suspect in places like Derry, which is a large city right on the border, and which voted overwhelmingly, one of the largest Remain constituencies in the United Kingdom. I think that will play fairly large, because people have houses on both sides of the border, they have businesses that straddle the border, they have connections with Donegal on the other side. In Belfast, in working class Belfast, I'm not sure they care too much. I think they're more like Stoke, Oldham, and some of those other kind of working class areas where they don't really see the relevance of this. And they're not that engaged with the All-Ireland agenda either of republicanism. They're much more engaged with, social issues and benefits and reforms and stuff.
Okay, Mick Fealty, editor of Slugger O'Toole, and Akash Paun, thank you from the fellow from the Institute of Government. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Now, what's happening with Brexit in the Lords? Debates on the Brexit bill have been happening this week, and yesterday peers voted against the amendment to the Brexit bill, demanding the UK retains its membership of the European single market. But one amendment concerning the rights of EU nationals in the UK might prove a little trickier for the government. It's expected to go to the vote tomorrow, and joining me now is independent peer Lord Hannay. Lord Hannay, do you think this amendment is going to be successfully voted on in the Lords?
I don't know, but I think there's a very good chance, yes.
And in terms of what happens if it is voted on and it goes back to the Commons, Baroness Smith has said that there will be no extended ping-pong between the chambers over this issue. Are you of that view as well? Are you not looking for...
I don't look that far. I would, first of all, we've got to see whether we can get it voted. I think it's a worthwhile amendment, which I know, focuses on what the British government would do towards EU nationals in this country. I've been speaking for months now in favour of us making clear where we stand and not trying to turn this into a transactional negotiation. And that's what this will do. It will ask the government to bring forward proposals on how they intend to handle these EU nationals within 3 months. And I believe that's the best way of also securing the interests of British expats who are living in other member states on the continent.
In terms of what you're happy doing and the effect a successful amendment and a bit of ping-pong in between the chambers will have, are you happy that the Lords could possibly be extending the government's current deadline of March for Brexit?
I don't believe that will happen. I don't believe that will happen. I'm sure that the government business managers have got a date written in after next Tuesday or whenever it is, which is the last when we will send the bill back to the Commons. I'm sure they will get on with it. It is not the intention of anyone that I know in the Lords to prevent that deadline being met.
I mean, what is your motivation then in putting these amendments forward and supporting these?
My motivation is because I mind a lot, and think a lot of other people mind a lot, about the 3 million or so EU fellow citizens, because we are still in the EU, who are placed in a very uncomfortable situation by the vote we took last June. The vote we took last June is now going to be implemented, and I think it's our bounden duty, frankly, to take some care of these people who have, after all, been here, some of them for many years. They've been paying our taxes, they've been contributing to our economy, they are valued people, and we need to take some care of them. Now, it's not a conflict with the government. The Prime Minister has said again and again she wants to settle this quickly. So do we. The difference is that we do not think it should be done on a transactional basis in which we trade off what we do for the other EU nationals here against what they do for ours. I've had plenty of emails from British expats on the continent, and they invariably say that the best thing we can do to secure their rights is to be generous about what we're doing with the EU citizens here, and that's what we're trying to do.
Amber Rudd said on Sunday that she didn't think there was any possibility of the government agreeing to any amendments. I was just wondering, have you had, since, in the past few weeks, any discussions with ministers or government figures over the possibility of them conceding this issue?
No, they have not shown any signs of that. They've been operating under a watchword that says no amendments. Well, if there are to be no amendments, then there's nothing to negotiate about.
And of course, John Major yesterday gave quite a criticised and well-received speech regarding Brexit, saying it's offered Britons have been offered an unreal and over-optimistic vision of what Brexit would look like. Do you agree with John Major's comments?
I agree on this occasion. I nearly always agree with John Major, but on this occasion, I agree very much with him. Yes.
I mean, just thinking about the House of Lords more generally, do you agree with this sentiment that there needs to be a careful line needs to be trodden in regards to the Chamber's unelected? The referendum result clearly stated what the British public's opinion was on the European Union, and that there could be negative effects if the Lords were seen to be blocking the will of the people.
Well, I think it would be so if we were blocking it, but we aren't. We never have been.
Why do you think?
In fact, if the government had not gone through that extremely long byway that took them through the exercise of the royal prerogative to being hailed up in front of the Supreme Court, we could have authorised this Article 50 triggering 6 months ago. Nobody, from 23rd of June onwards, there was nobody in the House of Lords who believed that it was either correct or politically viable to block the triggering.
I mean, in terms of, you've criticised a lot how the government's got about triggering Article 50 and their mindset going into the Brexit process. Do you think that Theresa May is the right person to be delivering on Brexit for the British public?
Well, I think she was the right person to be Prime Minister. That was my view last year, yes. Looking at the field, we weren't spoiled for choice, I admit, but nevertheless, I thought she was the right person, and I think she has many qualities. I had much to do with her as Home Secretary when 2 years ago there was an opportunity to opt out of a lot of the Justice and Home Affairs legislation and then to opt back in again. It's very complicated and I won't bore you with the detail. But she handled that very skillfully.
I mean, in terms of now having these months of Brexit, do you feel the same way about her?
Well, I think that she was dealt a pretty poor hand of cards when she took over, because for reasons which I understand and do not criticise, the previous Cameron government had not done any preparatory work at all for the circumstances that occurred. That's to say, a decision to leave. The reason they didn't is very obvious, because if they'd started to do so, it would have been a massive downer in terms of the campaign. So they didn't. So the fact was, the new Prime Minister found herself with nothing and had to construct an Article 50 negotiation. I do not criticise that. I'm not sure they've set about doing it in the right way. I don't think it was very sensible to make a preemptive choice between trade and immigration at the start, or rather before the start of the negotiation. I would have preferred to see them test in the negotiation what was achievable on migration and what was achievable on trade, and then make the judgment. So I disagree with the choice that's been made, in which immigration has been given priority and trade has been sacrificed.
Okay, right, we're going to... Oh, in fact, just lastly, the BBC obviously aired its first episode of its Fly on the Wall documentary of what it's like in the House of Lords. Just your quick thoughts on it?
I thought it was a bit of a caricature, really.
Okay, right, we're going to have to leave that there. Thank you very much, Lord Hannay. Now we're out of time. We're off to indulge upon mountains of pancakes. But don't forget, you can find comments, videos and much more on our Facebook page and on Twitter @TipTVPolitics. Join us again next week for all the latest in the week's politics. Until then, goodbye.